I had a job to do that morning, and that was the only reason I went into the garage. It was early November, the kind of cold that seeps under doors and settles into your knees before you've even had your first coffee. I was looking for the box I'd labeled Winter Coats Margaret back in August, when my son Thomas had loaded my things into his pickup truck and driven me the 40 minutes from my house in Hamilton to theirs in Oakville. I had packed carefully. I had labeled everything. I had told myself this was going to be fine. The garage was stacked floor to ceiling with my boxes. Most of them I hadn't opened yet. There was no room for them inside the house, Thomas had explained. He and Renee had a very particular system. I understood. I was a guest after all, or at least that was what it felt like, though no one had used that word. I found my winter coat box near the back wall, behind a set of golf clubs that hadn't moved since I'd arrived, and a bin of Renee's craft supplies with the lid caved in. I pulled out my good wool coat, the navy one Raymond had bought me for our 40th anniversary, shook the wrinkles from it, and stood there for a moment in the cold garage holding it to my chest. Raymond had been gone 14 months. I had sold our house in September. I was 68 years old. I had 31 years of teaching behind me. I had a modest CPP check arriving on the third Wednesday of every month, and I was standing in my son's garage looking for my own winter coat. I told myself it was temporary. I was still telling myself that when I went inside, the room they'd given me was at the end of the upstairs hallway, past the linen closet and across from the bathroom Thomas and Renee shared when the ensuite was occupied. It had been a home office before I came. There was still a faint smell of printer ink and old paper. The window faced the driveway, which meant I woke up every morning to the sound of Renee leaving for work at 7:15, heels on the pavement, car door, engine, gone. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company downtown Toronto. She was very busy and very organized, and she communicated most things to me through Thomas. The first week I noticed the baseboard heater in my room didn't seem to be working properly. I mentioned it to Thomas. He said he'd look at it. 3 weeks passed. I started sleeping in my cardigan. I bought a small electric blanket from the Canadian Tire on Dundas and paid for it myself. When I finally looked at the heater myself, I had been a homeowner for 35 years. I know how to read a thermostat. I found that the temperature dial had been turned down to its lowest setting, and then the small plastic cover had been snapped back over it, the kind of cover you'd put on to child-proof a dial. I am not a child. I had not touched that dial. I stood there staring at it for a long moment, and then I went downstairs and made myself a cup of tea and did not say a word, because I was not yet sure what words I had. I want to be honest here. Thomas is not a bad man. He works hard. He loves his children. He called me every Sunday for the 14 months I was alone in Hamilton after Raymond died. When he suggested I sell the house and come stay with them, he meant it kindly. I believe that. The problem was not his intention. The problem was the house he lived in and the woman who ran it. Renee had rules for things I had never considered requiring rules. The dishwasher was loaded a specific way. Leftovers were stored in glass containers with a label and a date. The good towels in the hallway bathroom were decorative. When I used one my second day there, I had not understood they were decorative. They looked like towels. Renee didn't say anything to me directly. She told Thomas, who told me later, gently, apologetically, that perhaps I could use the towels from the bottom shelf of the closet, the gray ones. I used the gray towels. I loaded the dishwasher carefully. I dated my leftovers. I told myself I was being grateful. I had a roof over my head. My grandchildren, Thomas's 2 boys, were down the hall. They were 11 and 8, and they still thought their grandmother was interesting. And then, on a Wednesday evening in December, Thomas sat down at the kitchen table and asked me to co-sign a business loan. He had been wanting to leave his job at the logistics company for 2 years. He had a plan, a small freight brokerage, working with local manufacturers, something he genuinely understood. He had a business partner lined up, a man named Phil, who he'd known since university. He had done research. He had a presentation saved on his laptop that he walked me through, page by page, while Renee stood at the kitchen counter with her arms folded and her face doing something careful and neutral that I recognized from staff meetings. The loan was for $280,000 through a business lender. Not a bank. Thomas and Renee's mortgage was already significant, and the bank had declined. The lender required a cosigner with demonstrable assets. I had assets. I had the proceeds from the sale of Raymond's and my home, $412,000, sitting in a GIC at the credit union, and I had a small TFSA that Raymond had contributed to for years. Thomas was asking me to put that money at risk for his business. I sat with the presentation open on the table in front of me, and I thought about Raymond, who had been an accountant for 27 years and who had told me, more than once, that the only thing worse than lending money to family was guaranteeing their debt. "I need to think about it," I said. Thomas nodded. He looked relieved, actually, the way people look when they've said a hard thing and haven't been immediately yelled at. Renee said, "Of course," and smiled. I went upstairs to my room, turned on my electric blanket, and sat on the edge of the bed. I am not a person who panics. I taught grade 7 English for 3 decades. I have managed 31 children at a time in a portable classroom in February with no functioning projector. I know how to be calm when my chest is doing something loud. I thought about it for several days. I did not Google Phil, though I wanted to. I did not ask to see more documentation, though Raymond's voice in my head told me I should. What I did was sit quietly with the feeling in my stomach that had started the moment Thomas showed me page 1 of that presentation, and I let myself acknowledge what it was. It was the same feeling I'd had when I saw the thermostat cover, the same one I'd had with the towels, the same one I'd had 3 weeks ago when Renee had mentioned, conversationally, that Thomas's RRSP contributions were quite stretched at the moment, and wasn't it lucky that I had settled so comfortably? And wasn't the room really adequate for one person? The feeling was, I have been moved into a position, and I am not sure I moved here voluntarily. On the Saturday, I sat down with Thomas alone, in the living room, after Renee had taken the boys to hockey. I had decided on the drive home from the rink that I would not be unkind, and I would not be vague, and I would not apologize for what I was about to say. I told him no. I told him I loved him. I told him the business idea had merit. I told him I believed he could make it work. And I told him I was not in a position to guarantee $280,000 of debt for anyone, including him, and that Raymond would have told him the same thing. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He asked me why I'd said Raymond's name. I said because your father knew money, and he knew what it did to families, and I am trying to honor what he knew. Thomas nodded slowly, the way he does when he's processing something he doesn't like. He has done that since he was 9 years old. That slow nod. I know my son. Renee is going to be upset, he said. I said I understood that. She was really counting on this. I said I was sorry to hear it. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "Mom, you know we're not doing this for nothing. This is our family's future." I said I knew that, and I said, "That's why I won't put my future on the line for it, because then I'd have nothing left if it didn't work. And I'm 68, Thomas. I cannot start over." He went quiet again, and I sat with the quiet, and outside a snowplow went slowly down the street. When Renee came home, she already knew. He must have texted her from the living room. She stood in the front hall with her coat still on and her car keys in her hand, and she looked at me with an expression I will not soon forget. Not angry, not exactly, but resolved. The way someone looks when they've arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion has nothing kind in it. She said, "I think we all need to sit down and have a realistic conversation about arrangements." I said that sounded fine. She sat down. She said several things very reasonably and in a very organized way. She said the house had been stretched with me here. She said they'd made sacrifices. She said Thomas's opportunity wasn't going to wait indefinitely for outside support. And then she said, still in that same reasonable voice, that perhaps I needed to think seriously about whether this living situation was working for everyone, and that if I wasn't in a position to support the family in meaningful ways, Then it might be time to look at other options. She did not say get out. She is too organized for that. But that was what she meant. I looked at her and I felt something shift in my chest. Not break, exactly. Shift. Like when you've been carrying a bag on one shoulder for too long and you finally move it to the other, and for a moment everything aches, and then it's clearer. I said, "You're right. I'll start looking." I don't think either of them expected that. Thomas said, "Mom, nobody is asking you to." I said, "I know, but I think it's the right thing." I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed with my electric blanket folded in my lap, and I looked at the window that faced the driveway, and I thought about what I had just agreed to do. I was terrified. I want to be honest about that, too. I was 68 years old. I was in the middle of a Canadian winter. I hadn't apartment hunted in 35 years, and the idea of being alone, truly alone, not widowed in a familiar house alone, but alone in somewhere new, made my hands go cold in a way the November garage hadn't. But under the terror, there was something else. Something quiet and steady that I recognized eventually as relief. I started looking the next morning. I did not tell Thomas and Renee I was looking right away. I am a private person. I wanted to know what was possible before I announced anything, because I have learned, in 68 years, that announcing something before you know it's possible only gives other people the opportunity to tell you it isn't. I made a list of what I needed. 1-bedroom minimum, ground floor or elevator building for my knees, within walking distance of a grocery store, a library, and a Tim Hortons. That last one sounds trivial, but it matters to me. It is where I read in the mornings, and it has been where I read in the mornings for 20 years. I set a budget of $1,800 a month. Hamilton was more reasonable than Oakville. I had not initially wanted to go back to Hamilton because the last address I'd had there was the house Raymond and I had shared, and I wasn't sure I was ready. But I looked at the numbers, and the numbers were clear. I found a building on Charlton Avenue. 8 stories, elevator, 1970s brick, the kind of building that has been standing longer than most of its tenants' marriages and is not impressed by anyone. 1 bedroom, 3rd floor, facing the Niagara Escarpment, a small balcony, laundry on each floor. $1,750 a month. Available February 1st. I went to see it on a Tuesday without telling anyone. The superintendent was a man named Dave, who was wearing a Raptors hoodie and carrying a key ring the size of a small planet. He showed me the unit, which smelled faintly of fresh paint and someone else's decades, and I stood at the window and looked out at the escarpment and the gray December sky above it, and I thought, yes, this is where I'm going. I put down the deposit before I left the building. I paid from my checking account, the small one I had kept separate from the house proceeds, the one Raymond and I had always called the running account. $1,750 for first month. $1,750 for last. Done. I drove back to Oakville feeling something I hadn't felt in months. I told Thomas and Renee that evening, at dinner. The boys were doing homework upstairs. I waited until Renee had sat down with her phone, which meant she wasn't going anywhere, and I said, "I found an apartment in Hamilton. I'll be moving February 1st. The silence at the table was very specific. It was the silence of people who had expected to have more time. Thomas said, "Mom, February 1st is 6 weeks away." I said I knew. Renee said, "Hamilton?" with a particular tone that I chose not to respond to. Thomas set down his fork. He looked at me the way he had looked at me years ago, when he was young, and I had made a decision he didn't understand, and he was trying to figure out if I was serious. I was always serious. "You don't have to do this so fast," he said. I said I wasn't doing it fast. I was doing it right. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Is this about the loan?" I said, "This is about me. It has always been about me, Thomas. I just took a while to remember that." He didn't say anything else. Renee looked at her phone. The heat clicked on somewhere in the house, that familiar metallic sound, And I thought of my room at the end of the hallway with its covered thermostat dial and its gray towel bathroom down the hall, and I was so ready to leave that I could feel it in my teeth. The weeks between that dinner and moving day were polite and distant and survivable. Thomas helped me organize my boxes from the garage without being asked. Renee made no further mention of the loan. The boys came to find me in my room to say goodbye the night before I left. My older grandson with his careful handshake that he'd recently decided was more mature than hugging, and my younger one who buried his face briefly in my shoulder and then pretended he hadn't. I drove myself to Hamilton on a Saturday in late January, one day early, because Dave had offered to let me in at the end of the month if I wanted, with the back of my car full of the things I couldn't put in the moving truck. My good coat in a garment bag, Raymond's photograph in its wooden frame, a bag of groceries I'd picked up at the Fortino's on the way. The movers brought everything else the next morning. The first night I ate crackers and old cheddar standing at my kitchen window, looking out at the parking lot, and I thought, this is mine. Every inch of this small, ordinary, good-smelling apartment is mine. The thermostat is mine. The towels are mine. The quiet is mine. I slept better than I had since Raymond died. In February, I started a routine. I walked to the Tim Hortons on James Street at 7:30 every morning with a library book or my tablet. I came home and walked the trail along the escarpment if the paths were clear enough. I cooked for myself. What I wanted, when I wanted, with no one rating my choices or quietly moving my containers in the refrigerator. I called my grandchildren on Sunday evenings. Thomas and I found our way back to something careful and real over the following months. He never mentioned the loan again, and I never mentioned Charlton Avenue as anything other than simply where I lived now. It was in March, 2 months into my new life, that I found the letter. I had been putting off going through the last of Raymond's boxes, the ones I'd moved from Hamilton to Oakville, and now back to Hamilton without opening, the ones at the very back of my storage locker in the basement of the building. Cardboard, marked in Raymond's handwriting. Office Raymond, not urgent. Raymond's handwriting. He had printed everything in small, even capitals. 31 years, and I still recognized it from across a room. I brought the box upstairs on a Sunday afternoon, and I sat on the floor of my living room with a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I went through it slowly. Old files. Tax returns from years I'd forgotten. The deed to the Hamilton house, which I'd already surrendered. A warranty booklet for a dishwasher we'd replaced in 2009. Near the bottom, in a manila envelope with my name on it, Margaret, in those small capitals. Nothing else. There was a letter. I sat with the envelope in my hands for a long time before I opened it. Raymond had written it 3 months before he died, during the period when he knew things were not going well, but before he had said so to me directly. It was 2 pages, front and back, in his careful printed hand. He told me he had been thinking about what I would do after. He told me he was not worried about my practicality, because he had never in 38 years of marriage met a more practically capable person. He told me he was a little worried about my willingness to let other people's needs come before my own comfort, because he had also never met a more stubbornly generous person, and those 2 things together were a combination that could be taken advantage of by people who loved me and also needed things from me. He said, "You are allowed to say no to anyone, including Thomas." He said he had put aside a sum of money in a TFSA that was registered solely in my name. He listed the financial institution, the account number, the approximate balance, and that it was not to be used for anything except my own life. Not Thomas, not emergencies that were not mine, not guilt, mine. The balance in the account at the time he wrote the letter was just over $47,000. I sat on my living room floor in Hamilton in March, and I held my husband's letter, and I wept in a way I had not permitted myself to weep since his funeral. Not from grief, though grief was there, from the feeling of being known, of having been seen, clearly, by someone who loved me enough to see the exact thing I needed before I knew I needed it. He had known I would need an exit. He had put one there quietly, without telling me, trusting that I would find it when the time came. I am not a woman who cries in public. I am not even a woman who cries much in private. But I stayed on that floor for a while, in my own apartment with my own thermostat set to a temperature that suited me, and I let myself feel everything Raymond had put in that envelope. Then I called the financial institution, confirmed the account, and made an appointment with an advisor for the following week. I still live on Charlton Avenue. The escarpment is full green now in summer, and in the evenings when the light comes down at a certain angle through my balcony door, it reminds me a little of the light that used to come through the kitchen window in Hamilton, and I let that feel like something good rather than something lost. I have built a small life here that is genuinely, uncomplainingly mine. I volunteer at the public library on Tuesday afternoons, cataloging donations, the same methodical work that satisfied me about teaching, the pleasure of finding the right place for things. I have a neighbor on the 4th floor named Eunice, who retired from nursing and who knocks on my door sometimes on Sunday evenings with a container of soup to share. She does not tell me how to store it. Thomas and I talk on Sundays. We have not talked about the loan, not once, and I have decided that is fine. He is my son, and I love him imperfectly, and he loves me imperfectly, and that is the ordinary truth of it. The boys come to visit sometimes on weekends, and I take them to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings and let them pick out whatever they want for breakfast, my grandsons, in my apartment, at my table. And something about that simple autonomy, the right to say yes, have the cinnamon roll, have two without asking anyone's permission, still feels like an extravagance I have not entirely got used to. I think about Renee's voice that December night, it might be time to look at other options, and I think, yes, it was. I think about standing in the cold garage in November, holding Raymond's navy coat, telling myself this was going to be fine. I was wrong about what fine looked like. Fine was not staying. Fine was not making peace with the covered thermostat and the gray towels and the careful dinner table silences. Fine was harder than that and better than that. My CPP check arrives on the 3rd Wednesday of every month. The TFSA Raymond left me is invested conservatively and being left alone. My apartment lease renews in February and I have already said yes. I read in the mornings at the Tim Hortons on James Street. I walk the escarpment when the paths are clear. I make my own food, I keep my own hours, and I sleep in a room where the temperature is set exactly where I put it. Your peace is not a small thing. It took me 68 years and one very cold garage in November to understand that. I am telling you now because maybe it will take you less time, and because Raymond would want me to. He always did know how to do the math,